Thanks again for coming along to this series of webinars that I've been doing for Firstbeat. Obviously, the central theme is all around heart rate, and today is building on some of the talks that we've done in previous months, and we're going to focus more around the recovery aspect with heart rate in football. For those who don't know me or haven't attended any of these calls before, so my name is James. I'm a sports scientist, predominantly worked in football most of my career. I've worked both as a practitioner in football in the Premier League. I've also spent time working in the commercial world for Catapult Sports, and prior to my role now, I was a lecturer or senior lecturer in sports science and coaching at a university in Liverpool for just under 9 years. And my current role is as founder and director of my own company. There's only me, so it's not like I run other people. But essentially, my company is called Malone Performance after my surname. And probably the main part of my work is running the Football Performance Network, which is my hybrid community, both online and in person, which helps out practitioners such as, physical coaches and sports scientists working in football with their careers and their knowledge as well. And then the other big bit of work I do is working closely with Casey's, which is formerly known as BASES, which is the UK's leading sports science body. And essentially, with those, I help out with supervision for accreditation, and I also act as a reviewer for those seeking accreditation as well. So hopefully that sets the scene about my background. Today's talk, like I say, is going to be focusing on recovery. I think recovery is one of those things which is in a way very straightforward in terms of how it could be applied, but maybe there's a lot of confusion, especially in the world of data and the things that we can actually use in practice. So the three sort of key things I want to cover today is firstly just explore some of the physiology around use of heart rate for recovery. We're not going to go into super detail on that. I want to try and keep it quite light and practical, but we'll just touch on some of the key systems. Secondly, I want to just highlight some of the key features within Firstbeat software and hardware, which you could potentially use to monitor heart rate from a recovery perspective and apply it both into a training and also then match context as well. And lastly, in the latter part of the presentation, I'm just going to talk through some practical strategies of how to embed this sort of data to hopefully inform your decision making and improve your general workflows day to day as well. So in terms of the physiology then, like I say, I mean that it can be quite complex. Obviously, the body and physiology is complex, but to try and break it down very simply, we have the autonomic nervous system, the ANS system in the body, which is centrally controlled up in the brain. And as we look through, as you can see on this image, essentially it spreads around the body and it controls a host of different types of systems in the body. From a heart perspective, a cardiovascular perspective, there's two areas of that which we really want to focus on, which is the sympathetic and parasympathetic pathways. The sympathetic is essentially the fight response. So this is where your heart rate will increase in response to stress or for exercise in our case. And the parasympathetic is the opposite to that. So that's more of our relaxed approach when it comes to our physiology. So at any moment in time, we are in balance of these two parts of the system, with the ANS system. For example, for me, when you're presenting like this in front of a lot of people, maybe the sympathetic system goes up a little bit. Or if you're chilled out at home watching this, hopefully you'll be more in the parasympathetic approach. So in football, we obviously try to monitor this on a daily and weekly basis. There's a number of different metrics that we could potentially use. For me and the ones that I've worked with exclusively, but also speaking to others, the two most common would be heart rate recovery, or HRR, and heart rate variability, or HRV. So they're the two that we're going to focus on specifically today. I just want to highlight some of I guess, the theories around those two metrics and measurement systems. So with heart rate recovery, essentially what we're trying to look at is the parasympathetic reactivation associated with some sort of stress response. So If we look at this figure here from Rav, if I pronounce that right, you can see in this example there's a 5 minute effort. So often with these sorts of tests, it's a submaximal exercise test. So we have usually 4 or 5 minutes of exercise. And you can see the heart rate goes from around about 80, 85 beats per minute, all the way up to about 140, which is obviously, not maximal. We'll be hitting about 75 to 80% of heart rate max. And that's fairly steady. And then as soon as we cease the exercise period, we see this sharp decline initially, and then a more of a gradual decline back to our resting levels. So this is a classical sort of curve that we'd want to see. If you're of a good aerobic fitness status, what you'll find is that your peak to trough almost, if you want to describe it this way, it'll go down a lot quicker. Wherever if you're less aerobically conditioned, or maybe you're undergoing a period of stress, what you'll find is that the curve is a lot slower, that recovery kinetics is a lot slower in its approach. As I mentioned, there's loads of different ways you can test for this, and I think maybe this is part of the confusion as to, what is the best approach and what protocols are actually practical. This paper I would highly recommend from Sushan. It's only published a couple of years ago, and it's a real comprehensive systematic review and I believe meta-analyses from memory. What it does in this particular part is it goes through and critiques the different types of protocol that we could potentially employ. The first one at the top here, which is our continuous fixed, I would say is probably the best, as I'll come on to. An example of this would be to run it, say, 4 minutes for around about 12 Ks per hour. So what we try and do is we try and cap that intensity of exercise and keep it the same, anchored at that duration. We also have an example here which is more continuous and it's incremental. So this is where the intensity of the exercise is gradually increased. For example, every minute, or you might do, for example, separate bouts. So maybe 3 sets of 3 minutes here. Obviously, in football, we're about intermittent exercise. So another approach might be to do separate intermittent bouts with a bit of a longer recovery in between. So an example here would be 4 bouts or 5 bouts of maybe 50 meters at around about 18 Ks. And then we separate that with about 30 seconds of recovery. And then the fourth one here is similar to the last one, where we just have it as an incremental stage, but instead of it being longer and continuous, we do a lot shorter to replicate the intermittent demands. And the last one, which is something that's gained a lot of traction, I guess, in the last few years, is to try and quantify this using football drills, so intermittent variable approach. So we might use something like a small-sided game. So let's say you do 3 lots or 3 bouts of 4 minutes, for example, in a particular format. Maybe it's 5v5, for example. And obviously with that, we are controlling the durations and the bouts, etc. The only downside of that is the variability game to game and also bout to bout as well. So in terms of ecological validity, it's probably the best one. But in terms of maybe what we're looking for from a physiological perspective, there might just be a bit too much variability in what we're looking at. So from the paper, these were the key considerations for people who want to design their own submaximal protocols. The first thing the authors mention, which I agree with as well, is it's probably best to do something more continuous rather than something variable. So in these examples, it would be things like, well, ideally a track. So if you're lucky enough to have a running track at your facility, that's the best approach, because that way we've got a continuous movement and we're not worried about any sharp changes of direction. Probably the more common approach in football, if you've just got a football pitch, is to do longer shuttles. So some people like to do width to width, whereas for me, I'd probably choose more of a pitch to pitch in terms of the length, just because then we have less change of direction throughout the exercise modality. The intensity should be roughly about 10 to 14 Ks per hour, which corresponds for most people about 75 to 85% heart rate max. So we can obviously manipulate that depending on age, on level, or the sport. So in football, we probably, in most cases, have it around about 12 or 13 Ks. And then in terms of duration, like I say, some people will have up to 5 minutes, some people go a bit less. I've always personally gone with 4 minutes. I find it to be just enough time to get heart rate up to where we need it to be, and also for players to kind of get into the movement and into the protocol. So up to you which you want to prefer. And then lastly, the heart rate exercise, what we measure then in terms of either that last little block of exercise. So some people like to do it as, say, the last 30 seconds, or we can then look in terms of the recovery, so maybe up to a minute following that end of the exercise period. And the last point the authors consider is trying to standardize this as much as we can. So I think this is where the practicalities become quite difficult because in an ideal scenario, you'd want to have it the same day in the microcycle. So possibly on a match day +3. You'd want to have it same time of day, same environment, same temperature. Diet needs to be controlled as well because if you have a lot of caffeine before your training session, before you do this test, that might skew the heart rate data. So obviously we're not in a lab condition, it's not going to be perfect, but if you can try and control for these things as much as we possibly can do. And the great thing with Firstbeat now is that they have this embedded within the software. So what you can do if you're running, say, the continuous 4 minute test that I mentioned before, in the software, you can easily just go through your trace. So if you've not got the time manually written down or stamped with the live system, you can look at the trace, look at either the movement intensity here, or obviously the initiation of the heart rate here. And then you can control for your test period. And then also, example here, look at that recovery period, whether it's a minute or longer. It's up to you. And then in the software, it can then track that longitudinally. So if you were to repeat this, say, weekly or every month, you can look at each player's individual trends to see, obviously, if they're within the typical sort of zones, the upper and lower bounds, or if they're trending upwards or maybe downwards as well. So really nice addition to the Firstbeat software, which I think people would really appreciate. But I guess one of the issues we face is when to test. And I think this is maybe one of the negatives of heart rate recovery testing is that, as I said before, you'd probably do this on a match day +3 or -4, depending on your model. And if we test around this point here, this will tell us essentially what the player has done previously. So if they played the game, they've had maybe some recovery on match day +1, maybe they've had a day at home to have a day off on +2. They return to training, and then in the warm up, you do your 4 minute protocol. You'll get that useful heart rate recovery data. But then following that, they're just going to carry on. So they're going to do the training for that day. And it's really, only after that session you're going to be able to really interpret that data. So that might have a knock-on effect then for your subsequent days in the microcycle. But again, it's not going to really tell us, leading into match day here, is that player ready? So although it's a really useful, I would say more of a fitness measure a lot of the time, it can just be a good dip in the water midweek to see, where the player's at. But then we maybe need to use other metrics in conjunction to paint the picture for the rest of the microcycle. So then alongside that, we might use something like heart rate variability or HRV. And essentially, although this looks a little bit messy on the graph here, what we're looking at is the variation in our heartbeat. So beat to beat, what is the variability there? So what essentially it's doing in terms of physiology is it's the almost a battle between the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems that we mentioned before. And what you'll tend to find, obviously, then if you're overtrained or overreached, or if you have a lot of stress in your life, that will certainly significantly impact your HRV. If you don't do any training at all and you just chill, okay, there's not a lot of stress, but then there's not a lot of fitness either. So it's about a balance between obviously pushing and pulling and trying to figure out how we can use this sort of data to inform our training. Again, one of the issues here is that there's a lot of different types of measurement that we can potentially use for HRV. So one of these, or these examples here, we can see from the paper of Rav again. Um, there's, yeah, there's a lot here, and a lot of these are quite complex mathematically as well. I would say probably the most popular or most common in a lot of softwares is the root mean square of the successive differences. So this one here. This will tell us more about the parasympathetic side of things, which is obviously with when it comes to recovery, what we're most concerned about is how well or how activated this side of the ANS is. Some people might use the standard deviation of the NN intervals, which is more of a global metric of both the sympathetic and parasympathetic sides. But for me and for most people, we'll often look at the root mean square differences just because that will tell us more about that recovery side of things. And again, the confusion comes, I guess, with the protocol that we can employ. So depending on what technology you use, obviously wearable tech is becoming more prominent in football. So companies like Whoop or Aura is becoming quite popular because we can literally, stick on a watch or a ring and it's measuring things 24/7. So you don't even have to take these things off. You can charge them as you go. That's obviously practically super useful. It's super low burden for players. However, the way they measure the HRV is through typically during sleep. So I believe with a lot of the algorithms, when you're in your deep sleep phases, they will take that HRV measurement. And that's great, that might tell us something, but to my knowledge, there's not a lot of validity information about these particular systems and also in the use of that type of measurement in the evening during sleep. So, potentially a useful method, but for me, still some question marks about, how valid is that information. The other way we can do it here is using a morning test. So, as soon as you wake up in the morning, the idea is that you ideally stay in bed. You will stick on your heart rate belt, your strap, and you'll then set off in your software on a, typically 1 to 5 minutes HRV measurements. So the idea is to try and keep in a lying position. If you need to sit up, that's okay, but you need to be consistent because even switching from supine to a seated or standing position is going to change your HRV day to day. So it's important to keep that consistent. So choose which one you will do. Also, as well, try and avoid, getting up to go to the toilet or consuming caffeine or food before these tests because, as soon as you get up and start moving around, your heart rate's going to start bouncing up and it's going to potentially muddy the test. Some people like to do this in the club, so they like to get people in either individually or getting the squad to all lie down on the floor in the gym and then do this test. I'm not personally a big fan of that just because, I know for a fact you get 25 lads together in a gym line on the floor, there's going to be a little bit of messing about. So ideally, if you've got the buy-in for it, you would get them to do it individually at home. And then obviously you get provided the information. The downside of that is trust, like with many things. And the third thing is potentially looking at your HRV post submaximal exercise. So using the protocols we mentioned before. So rather than looking at simply the recovery, so the peak heart rate to the recovery heart rate, we can look at the HRV and how that responds to exercise as well. Personally, I'm not a big fan of this approach. I much prefer probably the middle one if I want to went for validity. But again, might be something that some people might consider. So with Firstbeat, again, super useful tool that you can use is the quick recovery test. This one is a 3 minute standard test where you stick the belt on, you analyze your HRV, which is going to look at the root square mean that I mentioned before. And what it'll do is it'll give you in the software this nice graphic here. So it'll give you a percentage recovery score using the special algorithm that they use. This will be in color coded, so it's poor, moderate, good, excellent. And then alongside that, it'll tell you the current score, but then also what the 7-day average is for this. So as I'll come on to, one of the mistakes people make with HRV is going big off single data points. So if you just measure it, say like once a week with your players, it's not really going to tell you much. It needs to be ideally daily measurements, or certainly the main training days, I would say, because there is a lot of variability. I mean, it comes within the name, but there's so many factors that can influence this data that the more data points you have longitudinally, the more that you're able to, be certain of a particular interpretation. And just an example of how this could potentially be used in a practical scenario. So we've got here return to play. So with the quick recovery test with Firstbeat, you could obviously get the player in or get them to do this at home in the morning and, send you the information. That'll then tell you how ready that player is to do the planned session. So let's say you've got a return to play out on the grass, you've got maybe an extensive type session. You can just check in, seeing how the trends are. If the players may be, struggling a bit, maybe they've been struggling with the load the last week or two, you can then make some changes prior to that session. We can also then use Firstbeat information to track the internal load during the session as well, seeing how they respond to the load there. And then post-session, we can obviously take all that information together, look at that session data, and then compare that to what the goal was for that particular day. So just to show an example workflow there of using some of the Firstbeat technology, both the quick recovery test and also the general heart rate monitoring to inform your decisions. And I just wanted to highlight this study here. It's I guess a little bit old now. 10 years seems time goes quick. So this was from Robin Thorpe, who's, I'm pretty sure most people on this call are aware of who Robin is. At the time he did this, he was head of recovery at Manchester United. So this data was from his PhD, and it's a really nice study where he tracked in elite Premier League players, the relationship between external load through GPS versus the various recovery markers that they used at the club at the time. And from this table from the paper, you can see he's got some subjective measures. So fatigue, sleep quality, and muscle soreness. He's got some basic counter movement jump in height, I believe. And then he's got here the two recovery markers from heart rate that we've covered already, which is the heart rate variability, sorry, which is slightly different because this is log transform data, so a slightly different way to do it. And then he's got here the heart rate recovery, which is the percentage recovery score from peak to trough from the test. Interestingly, if we look at firstly HRV, there is only a small relationship, but it was significant, which is important statistically. For heart rate recovery, it was trivial to small in terms of magnitude, but it actually wasn't significant in terms of the statistics. So it was above 0.05 of the p-value. Interestingly, at the top here, we've got fatigue, which actually had the best relationship, both significant and large magnitude. But from a heart rate perspective in this particular population, these are at the time probably some of the best players in the world. There is at least some relationship there that warrants, particularly with HRV, some further investigation. But interestingly, from this paper I've already cited a few times from Rav, sorry. This was a survey paper a couple of years ago. So the top 5 leagues in Europe, so your typical ones like England, Spain, France, etc., managed to survey 72 teams across those leagues. And interestingly, only 50% actually used heart rate recovery, and even less used heart rate variability within their testing protocols. And then when the authors explored this further with the survey respondents, they found with heart rate recovery, the main reason was that they simply had no interest. So about 70% just weren't bothered about it. 11% didn't have the tools, the materials to do it, so didn't have the belts and the software. And then 5% found it was too complex for them to understand. If we then look at HRV, this was again just under 10% said they had no interest in the measure, but the clear sort of winner or loser with this one was it was just too restrictive in terms of how to collect this sort of data and use it practically. So yeah, really interesting survey just to, I guess, paint the picture that, yeah, probably heart rate isn't as commonly used as it should be, in my opinion. Something that I've spoke about on the previous webinars as well, the fact that we are obsessed with external load data with GPS, and we are still missing the bigger picture with the internal response, both during the session, but also some of these recovery markers around the sessions as well. Okay, so that was the first sort of main part of the presentation. By the way, if you've got any questions, feel free to kind of post as we go. I'll probably answer them all towards the end. But if you've got any as you're watching this, just please do post them in the chat. Always happy to answer. Um, Something I've been reading up on more recently, and something I think is quite exciting, is this notion of invisible monitoring. It's something, it's not a new thing. It's been in sports science now for a number of years. This concept of being able to monitor and test without being invasive with our players. But there's been some really nice developments in the particularly the heart rate space recently, which I think would be worth sharing with you guys today. So I really have to thank firstly the guys from Parma for this. These aren't my ideas. I'm simply conveying them, but particularly Mauro Mandarino, who's a good friend and someone who's done some work with my community recently with some of his presentations, which have been fantastic, and Mathieu Lacombe as well, who's leading up the department over in Parma. And when I spoke to particularly with Maro, what they kind of highlighted, which I agree with actually, is this concept of moving away from visible monitoring. So, for example, doing that sub-maximal testing that I mentioned before, where we're just getting that one anchored data point within the week, moving towards more of a daily invisible monitoring approach using the technologies that they already use. So what the guys have done is they've published a number of papers now, and the way they've approached this is using some machine learning techniques, in particular the random forest approach. They've managed to produce these conceptual models around the original Bannister model in 1975. I think that was published from memory. So it's around the concept of fitness and fatigue. So obviously we have to balance these two things in order to have effective performance in the middle. Now, with the first paper, they looked at I guess, the readiness, the fitness of the player in terms of, aerobic fitness. And they used the machine learning approach with the heart rate data. I believe they used Garmin, I think, within the study from memory. And they used the machine learning to predict the heart rate response, and then they measured the actual heart rate response within the model. And they found it to be pretty solid, not perfect, but enough to provide an invisible approach to predict the response each day. And then a similar approach was done in the second paper, but this time using player load from GPS, and this time more of a neuromuscular readiness prediction that we're able to quantify as well. So pulling these two things together, they produced this paper, which I'm pretty certain that all of you on this call would have at least seen the title or read the paper, which was published on Sports Science Reports. The title itself is maybe a little bit misleading, which I'll unpack in a second, but essentially they applied this concept of fitness fatigue using heart rate and GPS data to instead of having just one data point to try and track this across time. So they still used some maximal stuff as well. So they still used a little bit during the time at Parma. On the match day -3, they wanted to look at the fitness approach. So what they did is use just go back a slide, sorry. Oops. They used this approach that I mentioned before from the first paper, and they had that as an estimation of fitness. A match day -2 for them is actually a low load day. So they have this big load day here, high metabolic load day. They reduce the load on -2. And then -1 is the kind of readiness, usual activation type day. And with this one, they use the second paper, which is the readiness or freshness score. And then lastly, they wanted to then see the relationship with the physical outputs on the match day. So trying to look at the relationship between these three things: fitness, freshness, and running activity within the game. This table from the paper kind of highlight some of the key findings. So I've tried to summarize them here, but essentially, the highest probability of winning in this scenario was to have, high fitness, which makes sense, high freshness, which makes sense, but then coupling that with a low overall distance covered within the game. And then flipping that, the lowest probability was having low freshness, low fitness, but then still trying to cover a large amount of distance. And I think obviously that's where this title came from, which has kind of misled coaches to think that we don't need to run to win games because we still do. But what it essentially means is obviously tactically, if you're out of position and you're having to chase your tail because you're 10 meters either side of where you should be, that's going to contribute to the higher total distance. But importantly, which obviously I agree with as well, is that you do need to be both have good fitness, so aerobically and various other things that we need to do, and you need to be ready, you need to be fresh. Both of these things make sense going back to the original Bannister model. Not to go off on a tangent too much, but obviously to be fit, you need to run, whether that's in team drills, whether that's hybrid type work with isolation drills as well. I don't think it means that we have to stop isolated fitness work, which a lot of coaches have subsequently said. Um, but that's maybe a different presentation. But what I want to finish on really, so that was just a little taster, I guess, of where the future might be leading in this space. And by the way, I think there definitely needs to be more research and application of those methods across different teams and different standards as well, by the way. But the last part I just want to touch on is, how can we use these metrics and different things to inform our training decisions? So using the two, so I haven't touched too much on invisible monitoring just yet, but with these two focusing on HRV and heart rate recovery, the way I would personally approach it is I would use both in conjunction if possible. So HRV ideally you'd use on a daily basis. So using the quick recovery score, the quick recovery test from Firstbeat, lying in a supine position upon waking, put the belt on, do the test, log the data, gets uploaded to the cloud. Do this test for a heart rate recovery on a +3. Becomes a little bit tricky when we enter congested periods, but for most teams, in most weeks, you should be able to at least do this test once through the week. We can then track this longitudinally. The protocol I would not so much recommend, but one that is maybe useful to use is if you've got, say, just a football pitch and you can track it length to length. So let's say, a standard football pitch is about 105 meters. If you ran length to length in approximately 32 seconds, it works out about 12k pace if you factor in, maybe 0.7 of a second for change of direction turns. And then the players will run for 4 minutes continuous. So you run with them, control the pace. And roughly speaking, they'll probably cover just under 8 lengths, so about 7.5 lengths in theory. And then as soon as it's done, you'll get them to stand still. So no talking, no chatting, just get them to stand still for a minute to get that recovery data. And then that's it. The test is done. So 5 minutes can easily be done as part of a warm-up. Do it as the first phase of your warm-up and then go into more ball type work. And this way, if we track it over time, we get some really nice pictures of a player's status. And then it's all about trying to use the data to flag things for decision making. So, you can use the Firstbeat software I mentioned before, which has the upper and lower bounds for each individual player to do this. But essentially, if a HRV score is low on a particular day, that indicates something's going on. However, as I said before, HRV is so variable, we can't just take these isolated scores. But for example, if HRV data is suppressed for a number of days, then to me, that's a sign that something's going on. Sometimes HRV can be suppressed, but you can still get through things. And then hopefully most of the time HRV is in a typical range for that particular individual. And by the way, you can't have arbitrary numbers for these. It's all individual, so it really is about finding that, individual fingerprint for each player. And then similar with the HRR, heart rate recovery, is trying to look at trends. So if we have, say, a 14-day rolling average for each player, We can see then, have they got a decline just 1 week? Maybe they're carrying a bit too much fatigue. Is it over several weeks? That starts to become a concern. But if it's over, say, 2 weeks or more, that really does indicate that, fitness is dropping off essentially. But obviously, if it's in the green, if it's all good, then we can just crack on and plan and do our session as normal. So some things to consider. I've already touched on these. So standardization is really important. So we need to ensure that we can ideally do these tests same time, same conditions, keep the protocols very similar. And this is why I'm always a big fan of SOPs or standard operating procedures in clubs to have documents that clearly state this is how we do this and this. The other thing as well is, like with everything, is we can't just rely on one source. So even if we use, say, the two metrics here, it's only really telling us about, aspects of the autonomic system and our cardiovascular system. So we also need to look at training load. We need to speak to players. So if certain things do get flagged, we need to actually start conversations and not just scuttle to the manager's office or the assistant coach and start telling them information. Ideally have a chat to figure out what's going on. And then the communication as well. And I think this is where sports scientists get a bad reputation, is that we collect all this information and then often we don't do anything about it. So even if it's this scenario where you've got green or amber, so you might not necessarily do anything, I still think it's important to have some form of communication on that. So obviously for the MDT, that'll be easily done as part of meetings. With coaches as well, a lot of the time they just want to know, what do I need to change in my sessions day to day? So that's pretty much all they want to know. But then for players, players are quite inquisitive. They want to know, what's my data look like? So whether you either give them access to databases, which can be dangerous sometimes, or if you give them a weekly report or just some simple verbal or WhatsApp type feedback, I think it's important to keep them in the loop so that you're not just collecting data daily, weekly, and even if it's in the green, at least let them know that. And then intervention wise, I think again the mistake we make is to say, well, let's pull players out. I don't think that's ever the correct solution a lot of the time. Probably the most common way we'll improve things is by adjusting our drills. We can do subtle things. We can reduce the number of reps. We can maybe remove players from certain drills as a almost a last case scenario, or we can alter the role. We can change them into feeders. Someone who's maybe slightly less active in that particular drill. Maybe they're restricted by certain constraints like zones. Either way, we're trying to just reduce load and particularly intensity, trying to cap our, high speed distance and our sprint distance. Or the second part is obviously focus on recovery. So if HRV is down in particular, it makes sense to really reaffirm your recovery interventions. So it's not to say suddenly they have to do ice baths, they have to do massage and all these different things, but we need to essentially treat the symptom. So when you then speak to the player, if it's, heavy legs or sore legs, then it makes sense to employ something like cold water immersion to help with that. Different things require different interventions. So it's all about, individualizing that and keeping with the things that do have evidence and avoiding the fads or things that look good on Instagram, but in reality don't do a whole lot of help. Okay, so just to round off then, a couple of take-home messages from the talk today. Heart rate can be really useful, but only if you track it over time. So make sure we use things like HRV and heart rate recovery to track our stress response and also our fitness over time to look at our trends. Second point on top of that is to look at maybe rolling averages to ensure that we, look at things longitudinally and don't just make snap decisions based on single data points. And then lastly, always have a action plan. So it's no good collecting this information if then you're not clear on your SOPs, your process to then what you do with this data. So who do you speak to? What's the protocol in terms of action points? And then from that, what are the interventions such as drill changes or recovery interventions as well? Okay, so that's me. thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to connect with me, there's my details there. I'm obviously quite busy on social media, on LinkedIn and on Instagram as well. So feel free to give me a follow there. And obviously, I do have a free weekly newsletter on Substack as well. So, feel free to follow me there. But yeah, we've got, I guess, a little bit of time now. If anyone wants to ask any questions, maybe I'll just stop my screen so I can see. Right. So yeah, let's see if we've got any questions. Nicole has said thank you. So it's nice to hear. Thank you, Nicole, for turning up. We have Ross has raised his hand. I think you can join the call, Ross. I'm not sure. Do you want to try? Or maybe just type it in. There we go.
Hi, James. Can you hear me?
Yes, Ross, go for it, mate. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks for your presentation. Found it really insightful. I'm currently working with Liverpool under 21s, and we use the quick recovery at the minute as part of our post match screening as one of our tests. I just wondered if you have any insights in that with regards to any potential limitations of just doing that on, say, a match day plus one or match day plus two, and sort of comparing that data longitudinally to them relative days as well to try and inform decisions. Do you think that's beneficial, or is it based off your talk there that it has to be more regular assessments daily rather than just as a post-match screening tool?
Yeah, good question. Thanks, Ross. As I mentioned, really, the more the better with HRV type data, I would say. I think it makes sense logically to, if you can only test on, a certain number of days in the week, it makes sense to do it on plus one, plus two. I'd probably argue as well, plus three would be your important one because your plus one, plus two, you'd imagine would be suppressed either way. As we know, most players take 72 hours to recover from a match. So I think having at least something on that plus three or minus four, depending on the type of model that you employ. But yeah, like with most things, more data is always nice, but I understand there's obviously some practical limitations. But I'm interested, how do you use the data currently, Ross, in terms of interventions or things like this?
Yeah. So at the minute we have obviously that like subjectives with the lads complete. We have the match GPS data that we look for like large effect sizes, whether the lads achieve typically above where they are normally are in the game. We have counter movement and jump RSI, look at RSI model for that. And then with that as well, sort of like range of movement screen with the physios. And then obviously from an internal point of view, we collect the quick recovery test. So at the minute we will collect that plus one plus two where we are currently comparing the root mean sum of squared differences for whether that's on a match day plus one or a match day plus two. So we only compare that data to that same day. Say if a player does screen down on a match day plus one to where they normally are on a match day plus one, then we reassess on match day plus two to ensure it's where it should be in comparison to that individual average. So there's quite a few different metrics, but we found a way of making it quite efficient in how we collect and turn the data around to help inform the decision making. But the quick recovery test is one that we've only sort of implemented in like the last 6 months, so it's one that we're still just getting to grips with a little bit from a data point of view in terms of using it to inform decisions. But at the minute, just banking a decent amount of data for match day plus one, match day plus two for each individual, and then going from there in terms of having to recheck it if needs to be on the following day if it does appear down for that specific player on that day.
Yeah, nice, mate. Yeah, I'd be interested. Maybe we can talk a bit more offline after this call about this. But yeah, I think the key thing with anything, like I said before, is the reliability of your testing protocol. So, even
Yeah.
if you did consistently on plus one, plus two, but let's say, you test it one day in the morning, another time it's in the afternoon, or the lads have had the lunch or something before breakfast, all these little things can
Mm-hmm.
really, it can mess up the data, unfortunately. So
Yeah.
maybe it's a last question for you, but how do you feel about letting the players do it at home? Would you trust them?
Yeah, as you were talking about it, I thought, yeah, in an ideal world, it's great. I just don't know whether, yeah, we'll be losing more units, their first beat units, than we would be. Yeah, we wouldn't see as many come back as what we have done previously. But yeah, I like the idea of it. We do have a few lads, like you said, with the having a go with the Woot bands and stuff. But yeah, I think at the minute we just do it as soon as they report to the training ground, we do the screening before breakfast. So that's one way we've tried to trying to reduce that noise as a result of the potential caffeine or nutrition effects on the heart rate. But yeah, it's not perfect, but it at least gives us some insight into where they're at.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate you sharing that, Ross. And nice question. Like I say, let's have a little chat further about this offline as well.
Perfect. Thanks, James. Thanks again.
Cheers. Right, got a question here from Scott as well. You mentioned a couple of times the validity and lack of cohort research. What changes, if any, would you consider for under 16 or female athletes? Yeah, so maybe to clarify that with validity, I think it's probably more of a case of the technology. In terms of cohorts, I mean, there is data and information on those populations in terms of football literature. But in terms of validity in particular, I think the methods of collection, similar to what we just spoke about with Ross there, is how we're looking at things. So if we measure it in terms of that sort of overnight effect, so as I mentioned before, Whoop and these other companies that use it, they will give you that clear score when you wake up in the morning, and practically that's fantastic. But then to my knowledge, there's not really much peer-reviewed information about how valid those types of approaches are for HRV. So interesting space. Something I'm really keen to see more on, to be honest. But yeah, I think hopefully that's answered the question, which it looks like it has. All right. Cheers, Scott. Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Hopefully, the talk was useful. I believe Anina's going to send the recording out as well to all those who attended. So, if you do want to watch back on anything, you can do. And also, like I say, feel free to drop me a message, either email or on LinkedIn or Instagram as well. And yeah, let's keep the conversation going. So, thank you very much.